Thank you so much, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third professional development series. The name of this professional development series is Connect, Inspire, Share. So we hope we will connect as a group. We will be inspired by our guest speaker, and today is our guest speaker is Professor Kerri Krause. And then we will be able to share information, to share amongst yourselves, and also to share with our colleagues when we come back to our universities. So it's a great pleasure to introduce and welcome Professor Kerri Krause. Professor Kerri Krause is Deputy Vice Chancellor Student Life and Deputy Provost at the University of Melbourne. Internationally recognized for her contributions to higher education policy, research and practice, Professor Krause is an honorary professorial fellow at Melbourne Graduate School of Education, a lifetime fellow of the International Society for Research in Higher Education, and the principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Her research program spans higher education curriculum renewal, the changing nature of academic work, and factors influencing higher education quality and standards. Professor Krause holds the ministerial appointments of Deputy Chair, Higher Education Standards Panel, and also led the Ministerial Implementation Working Group for the transparency of higher education admissions. She has a track record of leading university-wide strategic change and organizational renewal, underpinned by deep commitment to engaging students and staff through cultural transformation. Today, Kerri is presenting on topic Student Resilience in Challenging Times, when hope and fear collide. Welcome, Kerri.
Thank you so much, Elena and Steve, for the warm welcome. And Steve is going to share the screen, and I will give a prompt when we move from one slide to the next. So it's very much a team effort here. Colleagues, it's an honor to be part of your conversation, and congratulations, first of all, on initiating this, this Zoom room. First of all in Victoria and then around the country. I think it's fantastic, and I am so committed to making sure that we do support one another in times like these. So this is a great example of how important it is to be connecting digitally, but connecting nonetheless. I'd like to recognize and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. My home is located on lands that are very important in terms of the legacy and the history of learning and storytelling, and certainly I think we have so much to learn from the past in terms of resilience. So I want to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge and recognise any members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who might be in our Zoom room today or perhaps listening post the presentation. First, I wanted to say thank you to every one of the 61 people on today's seminar. I want to thank you on behalf of universities and students for the phenomenal job you have done. There's a lot that has been said about the way in which individuals and teams around the sector have pivoted, but I don't think there is a real understanding of the toll that it's taken sometimes on individuals and families and the challenges that you've faced and the phenomenal job you have done. So I wanted to just say thank you so much, because I know just how much time and energy and home life has been committed to making that pivot. And today's topic seems very relevant. So while we're talking about student resilience, I think it's important to take a moment to think about our own resilience. And I'm pleased you clarified that we have a national audience. I'm speaking for a moment to our colleagues in Victoria, though. And it seems somehow appropriate that our title is about hope and fear colliding and coming together as one. As we prepare to open up pubs and restaurants, it's been a momentous week for those of us in Victoria. And as I read and listen to people talking about opening up and being able to sit in a restaurant or go to a pub, it does seem to be an interesting mix of hope and anticipation and a little bit of fear and anxiety. So while I'm not suggesting there is necessarily a parallel between student resilience and going to the pub tomorrow when we all can, I do want to draw a connection between the emotions that collide when there's a lot of hope and anticipation, and at the same time, fear and anxiety. And I was inspired for the title of this talk by a book that sits on my shelf, and I'll move to the next slide now. And it is a book entitled When Hope and Fear Collide. And I bought this book when it was first published back in the late 1990s. And you can read there the Amazon very brief description of the book. Arthur Levine is well known as a US researcher on the student experience. And you'll see the reference there to the topic of this book back in the late 90s. It was focused on a generation of students and their sentiments. And his conclusion was, based on his research, that the students were motivated by a conflicting sense of hope and fear. And while today's students, this is talking about students back in the late 1990s, fear a great many things, both on a global level and a local level, they are, according to Levine's research and Curitin's, less pessimistic than the previous generation as they look for ways to make a difference in their world. And as I looked at that book on my shelf and the title, I thought, would the same description be true of students in this generation 2 decades later? And more specifically, in a post-COVID environment, as we move to whatever it is, COVID normal, post-COVID, how would we describe the sentiment of the students with whom we work, and in particular with whom you work so closely? I would argue that this descriptor is just as applicable, perhaps even more applicable and apt for the generation with whom we are interacting now at university and broadly in tertiary level. I would argue that When Hope and Fear Collide is a very good summary of first year students making the transition into university learning for the first time. I think about the first year students who started at university, who started post-secondary study at the beginning of 2020. We at the University of Melbourne introduced what we called commencement ceremonies. So a major ceremony to welcome students, to give them a sense of what it was like to be part of an academic community. And our academic staff came along in their academic regalia. And it was a way to try to introduce students to what they might anticipate, not only coming to class, but also interacting with peers and with academic staff. We wanted to start them off the way we hoped they would continue, and that is in a community rather than in isolation. And then COVID hit, and we had to pivot big time. And amazingly, you know, with some bumps along the way for all of us,
Hi.
but we have been able to transition our peer mentoring programs to online Zoom. We introduced academic advising at the university this last semester, again, all on Zoom. But it really, all of this is in recognition of the fact that our students come, whether they're school leavers, whether they're second chance learners, mature age learners, whether they're full-time or part-time, they do come to education with a hope, but also with many fears. And what I'd like to reflect on today is, what is the role of your expertise in particular in supporting learners, no matter what age, what stage, pre or post-COVID? What is your role in supporting learners at that real inflection point, if you like, that moment of major change and transition that students experience. And I'm not talking about COVID here, although COVID has been an inflection point for the world. I'm talking here about the inflection point that is the transition and the multiple transitions that students make as they move into and through tertiary study. And I would say that each of those transition points is really a point when potentially hope and fear collide. And how do we make sure that the hope outweighs the fear and the sense of failure potentially? If we move to the next slide, the two terms I'll use here to frame the conversation are resilience and grit. And I'm sure many of you will be well familiar with the work of Angela Duckworth, and you may have her book on your shelf or in your digital library. She uses the term grit to describe passion and perseverance for long-term goals, a firmness of mind and spirit, and an unyielding courage in the face of hardship and danger. And I actually listened to an interview, a podcast with Angela a little while ago, and she gave some great examples. She teaches, she's an academic, and she talked about some of the ways in which she has supported her students through the COVID challenges. And that notion of grit is something that I find really useful. And for resilience, I'm using a fairly simple descriptor that I picked up from a guy by the name of Fred Luskin, who works at Stanford. And he leads what is known as the Stanford University Forgiveness Projects. And I'm not going to go into those in any detail, but I encourage you, if you're interested, to have a look at the work of Fred Luskin. Very interesting. But basically what he's saying is that resilience is a frame of mind or a way of being, a way of operating, that means that you're able to move forward without crumbling. I really like that. It's very down to earth, and it's a great, fairly colloquial description of a very complex and significant concept. And basically being able to move forward as a response to adversity. Those two notions of resilience and grit are, I think, really useful in thinking about your role. And if we look at the next slide, what I've done today, and I checked this with Elena and just to make sure, and Steve, to make sure that this was appropriate, but I've posed a few questions for you to think about, whether you consider them in your breakout rooms later, and perhaps in terms of your own thinking post today's conversation. One of the critically important questions, I think, in relation to your role and the role of academic skills development is, what role does your work play in building student resilience and grit, particularly in a post-COVID learning environment? And whether you acknowledge it or not, whether you experience it or not, I would argue that the work that you do on a day-to-day basis, whether it's online, in small groups, one-on-one, is playing a critically important role in building student resilience, in building their ability to move forward without crumbling, if you like, to take Fred Luskin's description, or in building students' courage in the face of hardship, in the face of doubt in their own ability. And I find this a really useful way to expand the notion of thinking about your role and the role that you play, both individually as well as in teams. And obviously you play a key role in working alongside academic staff within the curriculum and beyond the curriculum. And so you not only impact the resilience of students, I would argue, but you're also influencing the resilience of our staff, of academic staff, who are flat out trying to think about curriculum design, and you play an assessment and you play such an important role in working alongside them, working with them, and supporting them. So think about that question as you go into your Zoom rooms in just a moment. Let's move on to a very brief snapshot of a recent research study that was released out of the University of Melbourne. You may have seen some media coverage of this. I can take no credit for it. I want to acknowledge the work of Professor Lena Sanchi and a terrific team of colleagues who conducted this work funded by the Bupa Health Foundation back in 2019. It is available at the end of today's presentation, at the end of the slide deck. I've included some references so you can access the link and find out more about the study. I'll take out a few key findings for today's conversation. But first of all, they call the study, as you can see there, towards a health promoting university. And while the key constructs underpinning this work were indeed, looking at mental health and well-being, the framing of this work was about a health promoting university. And again, I would encourage you to think about your role and your work in the context of a health promoting university. How do you promote and support health and well-being among the students with whom you work? So you can find this study, a bit of background on the study. On the next slide, you'll see it was a sample of approximately 12,500 students. It was administered back in June 2019. And subsequent to that, so obviously pre-COVID, subsequent to that, the research team have only just completed a follow-up study involving 5,000 of the original sample of students. So they will progressively develop a longitudinal picture, a time series set of data on students' mental health and well-being as they follow pre-COVID and then post-COVID, they follow this cohort of students. And if we go to the next slide, very briefly, the 4 key areas or domains that the study examined are outlined there. And it went to both local and international students. So there are some important findings in the study that talk about the differentiated experience of international students as compared with local. And you can see the focus there on health and well-being, healthcare awareness and access, academic performance, and that's the bit I want to dwell on very briefly with you today, and then social determinants of health academic performance. So there is quite a complex array of scales used in the study, and being from the medical field, the team were particularly interested in some of the more clinical elements of mental health. But for our purposes, if we go to the next slide, what I wanted to share with you was some key take-home messages here, and very briefly, the findings, I'm sure, unfortunately, will not surprise you at all. When you look at the national data for youth around mental health, the prevalence of mental health issues, and data coming out of Origin, for example, and other sources, we know that we have an escalation right across the board, across the community of mental health issues. And this specifically focused on University of Melbourne sample, but there is also, as I understand it, a plan to have a national picture that uses similar measures so that we can start to look at the patterns of mental health and well-being issues in the context of a population sample. You can read here and again read at your own leisure about the findings. Some of them are quite confronting, as I'm sure you experience. Again, in your roles, you will see the complex array of challenges that students face as they come to you for academic skills support. We know that there are so many other factors at play in their lives. And I wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things on this slide. One is in point 2, other academic and social determinants as potential sources of stress and poor health. Have a look on the left-hand side, low awareness of services, and on the right-hand side, academic pressures. So we know that there are a number of factors at play in the challenges that our students face, but those academic pressures and their lack of awareness of services like the support that you provide, that certainly can play a part. And the important thing is, what do we do about it? And I'll come to that towards the end. Our international students report being more socially isolated. Again, a very confronting fact, but not a new piece of data. And some of the issues on that lower list there, I want again to draw your attention to academic coping difficulties. So in amongst these concerns and issues that students express around mental health and well-being, there are the key areas of academic coping and academic pressures and the importance that you play in providing the support that helps to build their resilience, I would argue, is really important. If we go to the next slide, again, findings you'll be familiar with: poor mental health strongly associated with poorer academic outcomes. Importantly, there isn't a causal connection drawn here, but there is a strong association. And then the last point there, most students go online for health and well-being information. And again, I think that has important implications for you in thinking about how do you position the support, the academic skills development that you provide in the context of a broader narrative and a broader suite of support structures to really build student resilience. How do you make sure that students are aware of the range of support that you provide? How do you make sure that what you present to students is integrated as part of a health promoting university? And in the broadest sense, I mean health and well-being, both academic, mental, social, and physical. We go to the final slide here for this study. There are several recommendations that have come to the university, and we're certainly addressing these as part of our priority around well-being. But I thought this was of interest to your work. Ensure that programs and services are aligned with the student well-being and mental health strategy and system. And again, this is not new in terms of advice to you, to me, in terms of a whole of institution approach, making sure that our work is aligned and integrated. But if we go to the final slide now, I've got some questions I'd like you to think about in light of that recommendation about aligning your work with a whole of institution focus on student well-being. So we've raised that first question about what role does academic skills development play. But my second question to you is, bearing in mind the key findings of the report that I've just shared, what role do you play as an academic language and learning professional in enhancing student well-being and mental health at your institution? Is that something tacit? Is it an explicit commitment? Are there ways for you to further influence and support student well-being? Is it a discussion in your own institution? Is there room for improvement? Really important set of questions. The third question I would argue is looking again at that recommendation about aligning services and programs with mental health and well-being strategies. In what ways are your academic language and learning programs aligned with your institution's student well-being and mental health strategy? Are you around the same table in conversations? Are there ways in which you might be more actively involved in those discussions? Are there some risks to be managed in that regard? And the final question to take away, and I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts on this so that we can have a dialogue towards the end. What's one action that you will take as a result of thinking about student resilience and grit, thinking about student well-being, and the important link that I'm arguing is there between student well-being, an integrated approach to health promoting activities right across the institution, and the role of academic language and learning programs, and the professional work and leadership roles that each of you plays in your institutions. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'll hand over to our facilitators. And as I said, the references are there, and happy to share that presentation with you. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Elena.
Thank you so much, Kerri. That's absolutely wonderful presentation. Thought-provoking, by all means. And I'm pretty sure there will be a lot of discussion, good discussion happening in breakout rooms. So now, Steve, over to you to let us know how we will sort of be split. And so Steve has organized the breakout rooms.
Unmute. Absolutely. Thank you, Elena. And just want to say a huge thank you to Kerri Lee. That's a really thought-provoking presentation, as these ones always are, especially around this topic. And there's lots to talk about. And in the first two sessions that Elle and I ran in Victoria, the breakout room following the presentation was always really robust, are always really robust, and generate really good discussion. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy this. I've put the 4 questions into the chat. You can take those with you and have a look and let them guide your discussion. I'm going to assign the breakout rooms now. There'll be about 3 or 4 people in each one. See if you can get through the 4 questions with that view to perhaps aiming to get a really good active strategy out of question 4 that you might be able to perhaps report to us at the end. We will ask maybe volunteers to say what action they might take, and that might prompt some more discussion, some Q&A with Kerri. So I'm going to pop you into those now, and I'll stop the recording in a moment, but they will be set up now, and I've just created them and I'm opening up. They'll go for about 25 minutes. We'll give you some notice about when they're finishing. Okay, so we'll see you on the other side, so to speak.
Thanks, Steve.